Okay, guys, first and foremost, I want to thank you for taking the time to allow me to present my action research findings. Like I told you earlier, this is from one of my graduate classes at Georgetown College. And what I wanted to be able to do is the main purpose of action research is to inspire change throughout your school building. And so that is the purpose of having this presentation and receiving feedback from you guys based on this. As far as feedback goes, I would appreciate anybody who participates and watches this. Obviously, I have my main two people, Mrs. Richards and Mr. Jones, but anybody else that happens to share and watch this, I would appreciate that you take the time to email me with any questions, things like that, and we reply all so that we can begin kind of a conversation as to how these findings can be implemented across the school. Not all of it, but if you like a certain section of it, things like that, that stick out to you, something that would help improve your instruction, then that's definitely a conversation that we want to get started. And I think it's easiest to have that conversation through email. And we can start kind of a meeting, a virtual meeting that way. But what I wanted to do was take the time to introduce you to my project. Obviously, it says Action Research Findings, which is the purpose of this presentation. But the whole point of my action research was using the inverted classroom or the flipped classroom to enhance problem-based or project-based learning feasibility in high school. And we're going to walk through and talk about some of the issues that you run into as a high school teacher with problem-based learning. As you look forward through PGES and get to certain aspects of it, a lot of it requires students to lead themselves and lead the classroom in their learning and have more equity in their education. As a result, we have to find different strategies to be able to engage them in that and allow them to have more of that ownership and to take more of a leadership role in the classroom and take it more away from the teacher being the sage on the stage to being a facilitator in the classroom. Okay, so first thing I want to do is look at the introduction and the history of problem-based learning, which was originally created by Dr. Barrows, or Mr. Barrows, I'm sorry, was created for medical students to get hands-on experience for real-world scenarios that they would be able to solve in their field as doctors. And so instead of going into a medical classroom, these students would be presented a problem, mainly a disease or a diagnosis of some sort, and find a way to solve that problem. How are they going to solve that issue, cure that disease, and heal that patient of theirs? Okay. When you take this to a traditional classroom setting, the goal is to create, like it says down here, create units around loosely defined questions that students have the freedom to answer using their skill set, creativity, and intelligence. The key aspect of that is creating a compelling question that doesn't necessarily lead students to one definite answer. Okay, and an example of that I used in this unit would be have African Americans achieved equality in 2015? And what students would do then is conduct research based on the background of that problem. Obviously, they would look at slavery, the Civil War, Reconstruction after the Civil War, moving forward with Plessy versus Ferguson and the beginning of segregation, and so on and so forth, into the Civil Rights Movement, and talking about after the Civil Rights Movement and the legislation that was passed during the 60s, has that guaranteed African American equality in job status, education, housing, amount of their population in prisons, living below the poverty line, things of that nature. But the idea is that students have the ability to go in different directions with that question, as opposed to one that is strictly, requires one answer, and that's the only answer that those students could arrive at. So you really don't want to structure them in so much to the point that there's only one answer, but you do want to provide them with enough support, especially being a high school classroom instructor. You're going to have a lot of issues with some students, not issues, I'm sorry, a lot of students that maybe don't have the knowledge base that is necessary for them to do well on the problem or on their project, because they don't have the necessary skill set or the knowledge to be able to put something like that together. Okay, and so what problem-based learning allows you to do is, one, it really keys on that engagement piece that a lot of administrators and teachers have been doing a lot more research and understanding that student-centered learning is the way that this movement needs to continue, but also on the fact that the students are more apt to remember learning that was used in application rather than rote memorization and having a teacher talk for 45 to 50 minutes in a class period. And so really it's more about the teacher taking a step back and allowing the students to take the stage and be the center of the classroom. And not only do you run into two problems with that. One, there are students that obviously don't have the knowledge base to be successful in that scenario, but two, you also see teachers that are held accountable by state assessments and are worried about giving up control of their classroom, because when it comes time at the end of the year to those state assessments, have the students learned the material necessary to be successful on those assessments? And so that's really a roadblock that you run into these two things here. Looking at the implementation, I kind of just went into that, explaining the problems and the circumstances of problem-based learning. But like it says here, the practice has been used in colleges and undergrad classes to increase engagement. It's a lot like cooperative learning, and so the really what we're looking at is the student-centered engagement problem-based learning versus a traditional lecture-based classroom. And that's what my study primarily focuses on in comparison between those two groups and what we can do to make problem-based learning better. Like I said, I just gone into the limitations of problem-based learning in high school classrooms, talking about the knowledge base that certain students will or will not have in order to do well on state assessments, and also whether or not teachers are willing to give up control of their classrooms. Now, one of the arguments that I would make is, yes, you are covering material when you're lecturing, students are taking notes, but does that guarantee that they are learning? And recent studies and research has suggested that students are more likely to remember material content that is relevant to them, that they are able to be hands-on with, and like I said, they are at the center of the learning and driving that learning. And so we're going to focus on primarily how do we get students more hands-on and give them more experience in doing those things, okay? Like I had said, the strengths and weaknesses of problem-based learning, a huge strength is problem-solving skills. Students learn time management, collaboration. Obviously, we've all had certain instances where we've had to work with a difficult coworker or somebody that didn't necessarily do their part. And also, understanding, how to get my part to fit in with everybody else's. What part of our project am I going to do so that then it can align with what everybody else is going to do? We're going to ensure that the group is successful. And so it teaches them to work with one another, teaches them to manage one another, teaches them to manage their time. And like I've harped on over and over again already, talking about student ownership and engagement. This is the goal of any teacher. And what we've seen in the last 10 to 15 years is a real focus on 21st century skills. Students have to be able to leave the workplace with the ability to use technology. I believe, I forget the author, but research has been done that in 5 years that the internet will cease to exist. Now, I'm not saying that the internet's going to go away. I'm saying that it'll be so much a part of our streamlined everyday life that it will just be. And so the idea that classrooms in 2015 don't use technology or don't use means of technology to engage students or allow for student ownership to happen, really we're not preparing these students for life outside of the classroom. And you really start to see a shift in education go from understanding knowledge that's in textbooks to your ability to solve problems, for your ability to work with other people, for your ability to create. And really I think that problem-based learning is the way for that to go. And so what we're doing is we're preparing these students for the new economy that's going to exist. But at the same time, we have to make sure that these students, one, are mentally prepared to take on this task, and two, are still able to take a part and do well on the standardized state assessments that are used not only to evaluate teachers, but schools as a whole. Okay? And so that's really what this implementation is getting at. How do we engage students? How do we give them 21st century skills? How do we teach them to collaborate and create, which is what they're going to have to do when they get out into the workforce and the job force? But at the same time, how do we make sure that the information being taught is the information that is necessary for these students to succeed and do well on those state assessments? Okay? Obviously, I know that's not an ideal scenario that, I don't want to say we're teaching to the test, but we also have to make sure that certain material is covered because that's what's required by Common Core. And so really getting to the heart of this, we've got to make sure that we're able to do that and that the state is able to see that on those EOCs, especially in U.S. history. Okay, so looking at literature, things like that, I did extensive review of problem-based learning. Like we had talked about with Howard Burroughs, the original implementation of problem-based learning was meant for medical students. And the idea behind that is that these problems are supposed to be similar to what people experience in an everyday setting. And the more encounters you have with those problems, the more ingrained the solutions are going to become. And so what's going to end up happening is the idea is that you're teaching these kids to identify problems in their real world. And then you're also helping them develop the skills to solve those problems or work together with other students to learn how to solve those problems. And that was really what Barrows was going for with medical students. It's, I don't want to sit these students down that are going to be doctors when they leave here and have them memorize a textbook. I want them to understand a diagnosis of a disease and then understand the ways that they have to problem solve. Because as a teacher, you can sit there and say that I know all the important terms, I know all the important theories of education, but until you get in your own classroom, it's a whole new world. It's a whole different animal than what you learned in college a lot of the times. You don't learn classroom management really until you're in there on your own. And that's kind of the same way with doctors. That would be the same way with students. And if you look at the way that the American economy is moving towards, we're leaving that manufacturing industrial base and we're moving more towards, like I said, creation. What can you create? What services can you provide? Things like that based on your ability to problem solve. Okay. We also see a student preference. There have been multiple reports documenting the successful application of problem-based learning at the collegiate level, and that students prefer that learning environment that accompanies the style when compared to a traditional lecture-based model. Again, colleges have moved to this because you see higher student engagement. Now you're dealing with a different clientele because you're dealing with the top level of high school graduates. You're dealing with students that are paying for their education and willingly going there because it's not forcible by law to make somebody go to college. And so what you end up seeing is a higher motivated base, but at the same time, these people are reporting back and understanding and saying that I prefer this mode better than sitting in a classroom and having the teacher or the professor lecture for your class periods on end and end and end. You retain more, and students are reporting that the problem-based learning strategy is useful in student achievement, and there's research to back that up, and that's some of the things that we're going to look at. And so really the question that I'm posing you, and we're going to get to this in a minute, I think I'm getting ahead of myself, so let me stop for a second. Also looking at the literature review going further, Albanese and Mitchell, obviously, the pro side of problem-based learning is that the student's cognitive ability to recognize problems and address them effectively increased, but it may not be very effective in every instance of student learning. So while students do benefit from a lecture-based scenario, okay, say that we're dealing with a lower level population and you have students that benefit from that. They benefit that because they're not going to find that information on their own. And they're not necessarily always motivated learners, okay? But at the same time, in these problem-based scenarios and looking at the way that the world is changing and globalization and the way that the American economy is shifting, you're seeing the highest paid employees, the best employees, the type of economy and industries that we're going to have is going to be about creation, problem solving, working with other people. And that's really why problem-based learning is getting this huge push. And I really think that our education system is moving in that direction. And the reason that I mention our teacher evaluation system and I mention student accountability, things like that, is because those are implementations by the state of Kentucky showing us that this is what we want you to do. We want to see student leadership. We want to see student collaboration. We want to see students producing goods, things that can be tangible and solving real-world problems. And so that's an edict that's being passed down by the Board of Education, but at the same time, we're still, as teachers of EOC classes, we're held accountable by these standardized tests. And so you're stuck in a certain scenario as to, okay, I want to give these students these skills so they can be successful outside of my classroom, but at the same time, I've got to make sure that they learn that content so that they are successful in the long run when it looks at the end of course assessment at the end of the year, okay? Now, when you look at the negatives of this, there's also research that suggests like it says here from Coe, that his camp argues that there is no significant evidence to support that problem-based learning creates long-term problem-solving skills. This camp bases their assertion on a study that's conducted of 13 different medical students, 1 to 23 years after graduation, which displayed a low correlation showing that problem-based learning supports problem-based skills. But most research conducted on problem-based learning has focused on learning outcomes of students and not on the process of planning, creating, and implementing this strategy. And so really that's one of the major gaps in problem-based learning as well, is have teachers been exposed to this learning strategy? Do they have the questioning techniques? Do they have the structure in place for students to be successful? And so when you look at those that have failed in that, what those studies don't look at is what was the teacher's role in planning, implementing, questioning, and then providing feedback as students created this problem, as students created the answers to this problem. And so that's really where we're looking at. And it would be interesting to hear some feedback from you guys as far as, do you think that this is a positive thing? You know what I mean? I would like for you guys to go ahead and delve a little bit deeper and do some reading and research on your own, and I can point you in a little bit of direction as far as that goes, as to what I've been able to read and give you some of those things. But I would be interested to hear feedback as to, you know, what you think is your solution, because you guys are also end of course teachers. What are things that you think should be incorporated that go along with the movement in education towards more student ownership, student learning, things like that, and you know where we're at as far as standardized tests, because you're always going to see education move faster than the legislation reform behind it. Okay, and that usually ends up lagging, 3-4 years, sometimes even a decade behind, before actual change in the legislation and the way that students are evaluated when it comes to, what are the best practices in education today. And some would argue that's a good thing, some would argue that's a bad thing. I would like to hear a little bit of feedback as to what you guys believe and what your opinions are as far as that goes. Okay? So looking at these issues and wondering what can we do about this. This is the intervention that I proposed, and this is what my action research is based on. It says, as a core content teacher in an EOC class, which is U.S. history, I am intrigued at the benefits that problem-based learning presents when discussing student engagement and critical thinking skills. However, there is specific information that students will be tested over that needs to be learned to ensure their success on the end-of-course assessment. Obviously, what I'm suggesting is that the EOC and forms of assessment for students in U.S. history are outdated, okay? But, like I had said earlier, you're also seeing legislation reform move slower than what best practices are in education. And so what I'm trying to do is to find a way around that so that, one, I can increase student engagement and student ownership, but at the same time making sure they're getting the information they need to be successful, okay? Going on further, I go on to say, knowing that this, I have proposed to introduce videotape classroom lectures, that's the inverted classroom, that will cover the information necessary to cover core content and guide students on their quest to answer the problem-based learning question that has been proposed. So really what you're looking at is it ends up being basically kind of the same thing, and I guess I could trim that down and use that term. I could use the term flipped classroom as opposed to problem-based learning, or use problem-based learning. And I know that it gets confusing, but really what we're dealing with is a problem-based unit with a flipped classroom element. Because really when you look at a flipped classroom, you have students that watch lectures and then the next day they come in and they do cooperative learning, but mainly with the teacher still guiding that, okay? What I'm proposing is that I give the students a loosely based question and allow them to research, but at the same time provide them with another resource, which is these videotaped lectures, to be able to move on from there, okay? And I understand that there's confusion, there could be some confusion based on what I'm proposing, and again, this is another area of feedback that I would appreciate when you get the time to look at and understand and give feedback based on how you think I could clarify that better, whether or not you think that that is something that needs to be changed, if I need to go back and reevaluate what I'm doing and how I'm presenting that. Okay, so that would be something else that I'd be very interested in that we could do in our virtual meeting and the emails. All right, so the research question at hand is, how does the implementation of the inverted classroom lectures help with the successful inclusion of problem-based learning into an 11th grade U.S. history classroom? Okay, so looking further out, all right, the participants and setting, obviously you guys are teachers here, but I'm still going to walk you through. It would be within an 11th grade U.S. history classroom, which is a required class to graduate here at the high school. At a rural high school in Kentucky. All right, there will be 2 class periods that will use the videotape lectures, which I'll refer to from here on out as the experimental group, and there will be 2 class periods that will not use the videotape lectures, which will be identified as the control group. Okay, and so at the end, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. And so this is the participants and setting. Permission slips were sent home and collected, so that this was done on the up and up as required by the review board that I submitted this to at Georgetown College. And so the environment is set, the field or the permission slips are sent out. All right. And so we're looking at, moving on from that, is the method of the data collection. All right. Quantitative data, meaning numbers, are going to be collected using pre and post test analysis. The pre and the post test are going to be the same test. All right, and so that's the only true way to measure whether or not these students have grown. And we're going to get into how I did that in a little bit. But these assessments are created from ACT's quality course, so they mimic the EOC that they'll see at the end of the year. So when I give assessments, I can basically, at the end of the year, give a ballpark figure of where students are going to land because I've taken that from the ACT FIP. And as a result, I feel like this would be a good indication of whether or not students are going to perform well in this scenario. So comparing the experimental group with the control group and their pre and post test assessments, pre and post assessments would be a valid indicator of whether or not this intervention was successful. And also, I'm going to conduct informal student interviews off campus. All right, and what this will provide is hopefully, students will feel free to give feedback. Tell me what their frustrations were, tell me what they believe worked, what didn't work, what was hard about it, and so on and so forth, okay? So looking at the data analysis that was collected, okay? A two-factor ANOVA with replication was used to compare test scores and identify whether the intervention proposed resulted in statistically significant test scores, all right? And what that means is basically it ran a complete comparison analysis between the treatment group or the experimental group and the control group. All right, and what we ended up seeing, and I'll get into this in a second, was a significantly higher growth in the treatment group. Okay, and like I said, I'll talk about that in a minute. But like I said, the ANOVA is done in Excel, and it compares both sets of numbers. I had 48 in each group, which gave me a grand total of 96. So I felt like the sample field was large enough to be able to prove that this was statistically significant, the intervention that I had proposed. All right. What I'm going to do is I'm also going to send out that data so that you can look at it, and I want you to be able to question, and looking at my explanations and the collection, the collections that I went through, and question, is this valid? Is this because certain kids perform better on assessments? In general, a lot of you, especially Mr. Jones and Miss Richards, have these students in your class, and so you'd be able to give me feedback on whether or not you think that is by chance, whether or not you think that is a reliable source of information, things of that nature, okay? Also, like I talked about, qualitative data was collected from student interviews and was conducted off campus, and they were open-ended to allow for student responses to be objective from the interviewer. And we're going to go through that at the very end in the implications section, okay? Like I had just said, scores from the treatment group suggested that the intervention was statistically significant in producing better results. When I ran the ANOVA analysis, the treatment group ended up with a 31-point growth in comparison to a 22-point growth for the control group. And now that's from pre to post test, okay? The average for the, I believe the average for the pre-test was in the 40% range. I believe that the treatment group went from a 40% to a 74%, whereas the control group went from a 48% to a 71%. Now, when I just gave you those raw numbers, if you look at from 71 to 74, that doesn't stick out as that would stick out as significant. They're still in the same grade because a 71 and a 74 is still a D, but when you look at the growth from a 40% all the way up to a 74% and 1 point away from a C, that is exponentially greater than the 22-point growth experienced by the control group. Okay, and like it says there, it would suggest that the classes using the flipped classroom intervention to guide their learning and provide valuable background knowledge perform significantly better than the control group. Okay, and so when you look at that flipped classroom, basically, and I should have done this earlier, but what happened in that flipped classroom is, students were listened to videotaped lectures that provided them the necessary background knowledge that they may not have always found in their research. They may have taken a different angle on African American equality, talked about the implications of slavery, but then focused on the civil rights movement. And really what we need them to be able to do is answer questions that are going to ask specific information for, the 1600s, 1800s, the Civil War, after the Civil War, the 1890s, then in the early 1900s with the progressive movement, things like that. So you're going to see specific questions on time periods that students may not spend a lot of time on covering when they present their project, and they may miss some holes in that problem-based learning or in that problem-based environment that they need to be able to answer when it comes time to the EOC. Okay, and like I said, any feedback that you can provide out of this, any holes that you see in my logic, things like that would be great, because you guys are practicing this every single day. Is this applicable? Is this practical for what you do? Is this something that you would be interested in doing? Okay. So, looking at the interviews on the data analysis positives, students reported back that they enjoyed the fact that they were in control of their learning pace and their environment. Students were able to delve into certain areas of a topic that they may not have necessarily been able to do. You know, students are able to evaluate what they know, what they don't know. One, based on the pretest, but also in knowing that what they're going to be asked to do on the standardized test at the very end of the unit. And so they're able to fill in that knowledge and understand, okay, what do I need to know? What don't I need to know? And so they enjoy that aspect of it. It goes on to say the idea that the students were in charge of what information they needed and that the unit was personalized to them allowed for them to take more accountability for what they learned. A term that was frequently used was cookie cutter, meaning that everyone had to learn the same thing in a lecture-based classroom. Again, I would argue that in a lecture-based classroom, I think it is only the teacher that feels better after that has occurred, because students do learn in that environment. I'm not going to say that lectures are not viable options for the classroom, but I'm also not going to say that coming in every single day and listening to somebody talk for 65 minutes is conducive to a student learning and retaining every single bit of information. So I would say that a teacher that only lectures says that, well, I taught something, but just because you teach doesn't mean that learning is occurring. And if learning is occurring, are you really teaching? That would be the question that I would pose as well. Okay. Negatives that students reported. Students struggled with the idea of time management, group accountability, and not being guided by a teacher directly at times. And students also noted that had this been the classroom procedure all year, that they would have been better adapted and as a result more successful. So it's just a matter of being acclimated, understanding that this is something that they needed to get used to. They're probably not used to holding their peers accountable, not used to holding themselves accountable, managing their time, understanding that, okay, so instead of going home and watching TV or sitting on my phone or playing on the computer, I need to make sure that I get my part of the project taken care of, or whatever we're going to need for tomorrow, I make sure that I go to the store, or I'm able to research this and go to the library or get on the computer and look this stuff up so that my group can be successful. That's a hard concept even for adults to grasp, much less for kids in a junior high, or not junior high, a junior high school U.S. history class. Because like I had said, it's almost like we have trained them to be passive learners. Not almost like, we have. We have trained them to be passive learners, and in that passivity, they lose their engagement. And so this is a whole new ball game when they're introduced to this instructional strategy. So like I said, not only are we increasing what they're learning, we're also increasing their equity or their ownership of the learning, because they're the ones that are driving it. And it's not merely just grade-based. If I don't do this, I'm going to get a bad grade. But the idea is that you transform the mindset as, I am becoming a better student. I am becoming a better person, a more intelligent person, and as a result, a more well-off person because of what I am learning. All right, and I know I kind of went off on a tangent there and went away from the problem or the analysis itself, but I thought that was a relevant point to put in there and point out and make sure that we covered that as well. So implications. All right, like I had said, I appreciate you guys sitting down to take the time to listen to this. I've tried not to ramble. I appreciate any and all feedback that you're able to give me. So please make sure that we're able to do that as soon as possible, within a week after you watch this. I hope that I've given you enough time, because I need to be able to put it together by June 5th. I'm sorry, not June 5th, but by June 4th at the very latest, and put things together. But implications. Students were more successful in a flipped classroom environment, as evidenced by the ANOVA data analysis. We saw the growth from a 40% to a 74%, a 31-point swing. Okay, so 40, it's not exactly 40 because that's a 34-point swing. But math aside, so it was probably 42, 43. But you see a 31-point swing in that experimental group as compared to a 22-point swing when you look at the control group. I think that is evidence enough to suggest that flipped classroom environment was successful. It provided students the background knowledge they needed to be able to do well on the assessment at the end of the unit. But also in class, we're not just doing sit and get. We're not doing lecture-based learning, and we're not being passive learners. Okay, and so we're passing on the idea that my instruction has to change. My instructional practices, strategies has to change. But here's the information that you need to know, and you're able to access that, because this generation will sit and watch a video. This generation struggles with sitting and reading information. And so that's why I proposed the flipped classroom, the technology, because students don't want to read from a book anymore. I could give two students. I could give one a book, and I could give one a tablet. And the student with the tablet is more likely to read. They could be the same text. The student with the tablet is more likely to read from that media than they are from the textbook media. And that's just the way that they've been brought up. That's what they've grown up around. And you're only going to see the infusion of technology take off more and more. And so as educators, as teachers, as formers, as molders of youth, we need to make sure that we're on that cutting edge and that we're pushing student engagement. We're finding ways to reach them and educate them. Okay, like it said, and I just kind of went off on that. Student equity in their education was increased as a result of the problem-based learning unit, and the structure necessary to succeed on the standardized test was provided by the Flipped Classroom Initiative, which is pretty much what I went into right there. And then students are more likely to engage in content when the product requires application of standard principles through the use of technology, meaning that the content was better retained by students when they're applying it, when they're creating a project. The goal of education is not to have them memorize terms, okay? Even though it seems like that. So through the problem-based learning unit, they're then taking those terms and basic knowledge that they need to know and applying it to a greater product at the very end, the product being their project. And as a result, we're making that learning meaningful because they're answering a relevant question, African American equality in 2015. You look at Baltimore, you look at Missouri, and you understand that this is still a real world issue. Racism in the United States is still a real issue. And so that's the goal of problem-based learning, is that students are collaborating, they're engaged, they're owning, but they're also solving real world problems. Okay. Like I said, I thank you for taking the time. I realize